Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to the third seminar of International Theory Network organized by SIPS. Let us begin by recognizing that most of us in this room are guests of the unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. My name is Ajay Vucetic with Kevin McMillan, who unfortunately is not here. We try to have seminars that deal with international relations and international theory more generally. So far, we've been doing this maybe for 3 or 4 years. So far, we had no talks on what is a transformational process in international politics right now, and that is the rise of international global indigenous rights and global indigenous politics. And we're very lucky to have Professor Sharon Lightfoot coming from the University of British Columbia today to talk about subject of her work, namely her book in 2016, published with Routledge, but also her work more generally. She's professor of professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous politics and Indigenous rights. She holds PhD from the University of Minnesota, where she studied with Professor Bud Duval. Some of you might know his name as well. And has for many years, 15 years, worked as an activist in American Indian politics in the United States. If I'm correct, you are Anishinaabe, a citizen of the Great Lakes, Lake Superior band of Ojibwe, and this is a very interesting topic that is only slowly advancing on our syllabi and our discussions here at the University of Ottawa, perhaps less than at some other universities, which is why you're here today, to tell us what to do next. And the format, as I explained, is very similar. It's to most seminars, 30 to 40-minute presentation, and we'll open it up for Q&A. And please join me in thanking Professor Lightfoot for being here today.
Many thanks for that wonderful introduction, warm welcome. Yeah, it's really a privilege to be here, and thank you for opening with the land acknowledgement. That was first on my list, so thank you for taking care of that for me, and for the quite comprehensive introduction also, thank you. And also thanks to all of you for coming out in an afternoon in December. I know that's not necessarily in keeping with everyone's ambitious schedules at the moment for final work before we all head towards the holiday break, so I appreciate you taking the time to come out this afternoon really very much. I'm just coming back, just flew in last night from Bogota, so this is actually my third different talk this week out of 4, so tomorrow will be the next one. So bear with me if I have a few lapses. Fortunately, Bogota's on the same time zone, so jet lag itself is not so much a problem, but just kind of travel weary and talk weary at this point in the season. So I hope you'll bear with me if I have a few lapses in energy. But I will definitely try to stay on top of it, because this is probably the topic most near and dear to my heart right now, and so I'm really privileged to be here and be a part of this conversation. So of course, what I want to talk to you about today is this subject, which as an Anishinaabe political scientist of international relations, but also as a citizen of the world and an Indigenous citizen of U.S. and now Canada, which is interesting because I was born on the border. So I always say the border is a fairly new phenomenon. Our people have been living around the lake and around the lake shore for somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years, and the border is a very new construction. So my people, my family actually traverse Lake Superior, and that's our territory. So we're not far from my territory right now. So I'm really, again, pleased to be here and talk about that. But professionally, I'm a political science and international relations political scientist who's also coming from an Indigenous activist, community-based perspective, and with academic training in human rights and IR. So I'm bringing these two together at a very critical moment in what I see as political history in the world right now. So what I want to talk about in my time this afternoon is how I'm viewing the quest for Indigenous rights globally and also domestically, and how I see this as potentially, and I always Thank you. I was underline and underscore the word potentially because it carries a lot of weight in what I'm going to say. What I could call a revolutionary or an evolutionary path towards something different in the political order, in the legal order, and governance in society. And I think it's a future that really requires substantial effort from all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to think outside existing boxes and to design what we see this is going to be into the future. And as often discussed in critical IR, and my ties to Minnesota and Bud Duvall was mentioned, and that definitely informs my work. I come from the critical IR perspective. We see the discipline of Indigenous or international relations as quite a conservative discipline. It has a set of enshrined fundamental assumptions that for Indigenous peoples are highly problematic. Presumptions about the state, about liberalism, and about human rights, all of which, individually and working in conjunction with one another, mask certain sets of problematic power relations and have worked for many, many years to overlook, silence, or completely erase Indigenous peoples, our political orders, and our ways of living and being in the world, and how we view the international and its significance. However, being an optimist, I think there's been a very recent opening, and I think that this new energy is pushing for an inclusion of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous worldviews and respect for Indigenous rights, for an inclusion of these ideas. So while I think this is ultimately a hopeful turn, I also want to discuss why it's so very challenging to get there and some of the nitty-gritties on how, if we take this path seriously, we could all end up transformed by this new set of relations. It's slow, but we get there. Okay. So, as was mentioned, I published a book last year with Routledge, and it's a very expensive book, so check your library for it. Although, do you have it? Okay. And there is an e-copy available, and actually Kindle has it for a reasonable price. It's certainly an academic price. As you can see, the price is a little bit of point of dispute between me and the publisher, because I want to get this in the hands of not only Indigenous scholars, but non-Indigenous scholars, and so the price, I think, is creating a barrier. But anyway, that's a side discussion. So in the book, I argue that while Indigenous peoples have been largely dismissed as non-state actors, and Indigenous rights for the most part around the world cast off as aspirational and non-binding human rights, I argue that what's actually going on with Indigenous rights is something bigger, deeper, and actually quite the contrary of all of that if we really examine it. So the title of the book is Global Indigenous Rights, A Subtle Revolution, and in it the main argument is that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is more than just a new set of rights and norms emerging and diffusing on the global scale, on the global stage, but it actually represents this potential moment of revolutionary transformation. But as is typical of Indigenous issues and politics, normally overlooked and certainly underappreciated. So the body of Indigenous political and legal theory that really has emerged in what I would call blossomed and exploded on the academic scene since the 1990s, all of that body of legal and political theory speaks directly to the colonial assumptions of international politics. And it intervenes in a particular set of openings that were provided by earlier post-colonial scholarship of the decades prior. And if we examine international politics through this lens of Indigenous political theory, we reveal a very problematic global state of what I call, but there are many other terms for it, an incomplete post-coloniality. A state of settler colonialism, of course, has never ended for Indigenous peoples in these settler colonies. And also we have in the developing post-colonial world a situation where many times Indigenous peoples are not recognized as Indigenous peoples. So this occurs throughout Africa and Asia. So we have an incomplete post-colonial project. And it results from institutional and structural exclusions and erasure of indigenous peoples around the world, and certainly from existing forms of governance for the most part. So indigenous political and legal theory calls for actually a post-colonial completion of the project. So it wants to right the exclusion from the previous post-colonial period. And through this indigenous inclusion, but more so accommodation. So the global post-colonial completion challenge then is that indigenous inclusion and accommodation are not as easy as we think at first blush. And ultimately, if we're going to do both accommodation and inclusion, it requires us to rethink some not so small things. The state, what decolonization means, what liberalism means, how we do diplomacy, and Westphalian sovereignty. No small order.
Mm-hmm.
So two arguments that I bring forward, and in my time I will bring two from the book. The first argument is that the UN Declaration, as I previously nodded to, was actually a significant global achievement because it represents this overlooked and underappreciated transformational moment in global politics. Because from its earliest beginnings, the indigenous rights movement at the United Nations and transnationally, by seeking international recognition of indigenous rights, by definition sought a fundamental set of transformative changes in the United Nations, the human rights system, and then by extension the wider international system. And as I mentioned, some of these are small, so inclusion actually is the easier part of the project. Those are small changes. Accommodation becomes more subtly revolutionary. And so the indigenous rights regime, as articulated in the UN Declaration, does not merely add a new set of rights for a new population, it forces us to rethink fundamentals. So the second argument then follows from the first. Because of the transformative nature of indigenous rights, the real potential of the UN Declaration lies in its implementation. And this is where we're beginning to struggle in Canada, right? So, in other words, the potential of it lies in its potential, to make it a very simple point. And so the real potential that lies within implementation involves significant domestic and global change. And it's change that cannot simply be compartmentalized for indigenous peoples within existing systems. It requires those systems to change. So I posit that the UN Declaration and indigenous rights represent three fundamental changes to rights of indigenous peoples, but also to the wider conduct of global politics. So first of all, adoption of the UN Declaration represented the first time that a broad set of collective rights was accepted in the global human rights consensus. And again, from its earliest beginnings in the 1970s, this indigenous rights movement that has worked transnationally and at the United Nations has asserted that an exclusive individual rights framing of human rights was and remains insufficient for indigenous peoples, and that it actually continued to do violence to indigenous peoples as peoples. So indigenous peoples, in order to survive as peoples of the world, also needed the protections that a collective set of rights provides. So not only in the area of cultural and social rights, but also land rights and political self-determination. Now the UK and the United States, along with other nations like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, have all expressed long-standing concerns about collective rights and compatibility of collective rights with individual rights, arguing that any recognition of collective rights leaves individuals within groups vulnerable and without the protection provided by human rights. So that they always saw that there was a contradiction between the two. And indigenous rights activists that I've spoken with, and there have been many over the years, report that during the entire Cold War era, so the 70s, the 80s, the United States vociferously opposed any international instrument that included collective rights provisions out of fear that this was part of the wider communist agenda. So when the UN Declaration appeared as a broad statement in support of collective rights and did eventually pass by a majority of 143 yes votes in the General Assembly, It was voted on by the UK with a yes, and then later on endorsed by the United States. This was clearly a transformational moment in Cold War politics, post-Cold War politics. And notably, in the 2010 United States Statement of Endorsement to the UN Declaration included a specific statement in support of collective rights of Indigenous peoples. That was the first time in U.S. history that they had ever supported collective human rights. So that in and of itself is a fundamental shift in the longstanding U.S. position and power politics on collective rights. So a door has opened. Secondly, the UN Declaration morally and politically corrects the discriminatory legal exclusions of Indigenous peoples from the earlier global decolonization project. So again, back to the 70s, the Indigenous rights movement from its beginnings sought to correct two highly discriminatory legal doctrines that have been the foundation of all English-speaking settler states. The doctrine of discovery and the saltwater or blue water thesis exclusion of decolonization. So the doctrine of discovery, of course, originates back from the age of exploration and the papal bulls, which justified European discovery claims and exertions of sovereignty over new territories. In other words, non-European lands and peoples, and actually it's based in religion. So the doctrine of discovery provides Christians with the ability to claim sovereignty over non-Christian peoples and lands. So that's still on the books as law. It's one of the earliest international laws, and it's still actually technically in play. Now, the saltwater thesis, and for those of you who may be familiar with decolonization and the UN's program of decolonization from the 60s, 70s, and forward, was also grounded in very particularly discriminatory exclusion. So in 1960, the United Nations officially delegitimized colonial rule with the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to colonial countries and peoples. And so while this 1960 UN declaration proclaimed that all peoples have the right of self-determination, it failed to define peoples or give us any guidance on how to determine who was actually eligible for decolonization. So discussion and conflict immediately rose between global proponents of what was the Belgian thesis, and these states argued that all peoples, including those that had been colonized within existing states, should be eligible for the right of self-determination. And then there was an alternative argument, which ended up being called the saltwater or blue water thesis, that argued only non-contiguous colonial territories, so Africa and Asia and so on, were eligible, those over salt water, eligible for decolonization and self-determination. And strangely enough, the saltwater thesis found support among an unusual coalition of the settler colonial states of the Western Hemisphere, joined by Australia and New Zealand, and the Soviet Communist bloc, which during that time, the 1960s, was a pretty rare alliance. And they considered, the Communist bloc considered the Belgian thesis a direct attack on the multi-ethnic Soviet Union. So these two forces aligned, and as a consequence, the saltwater thesis became the prevailing rule in decolonization, thus defining those eligible for decolonization and actually self-determination as those living in overseas colonies, and excluded Indigenous peoples entirely from the project. And by extension, then provided Indigenous peoples with either no right to self-determination like all other peoples had, or at best a reduced right to self-determination. So the UN Declaration sought, and the Indigenous movement sought, to delegitimize both of these principles in international law and domestic law for those countries that still have doctrine of discovery in place, and to technically correct those exclusions. Although, as we know and see every day, how to accomplish this remains on the ongoing item of negotiations, both globally and domestically. So the third change. The Indigenous rights movement and the UN Declaration have presented to the world a guiding framework for Indigenous state relations based on a new and emerging global understanding of self-determination, which I will pick up and talk deeper about at the end of my talk. So Article 3 of the UN Declaration states simply that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination equal to all other peoples. At the same time, one of the most highly controversial articles of the UN Declaration is Article 46, which provides protection for state sovereignty and territorial integrity. And just as a side note, this is an article that Indigenous activists and organizations had absolutely no role in drafting or including in the Declaration. It was added at the very end, and they ended up not opposing it either because they wanted it to pass. So with this decolonization project of the 60s, 70s, 80s, largely, although not entirely completed, the open global question is, what does self-determination mean for peoples of the world moving forward? If it means something other than a sovereign, independent, territorial state, what does it mean? How do we construct that? According to the text of the UN Declaration, at close read, Indigenous peoples' self-determination means that they have, quote, the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And within the text, we have many possibilities mentioned: self-government, autonomy, and various types of political engagement with the state with the consent of Indigenous peoples. So virtually all of the Indigenous activists that I've interviewed over the course of almost a decade have all expressed the desire for independent or autonomous structures from the state, but only a few expressed a desire for statehood per se. As one individual told me, the state is inherently a European colonial structure, and so we do not base our claims on it. What we seek is independence as nations, as peoples. We seek freedom and the space to live and govern ourselves as we see fit. That's self-determination. Statehood can provide it, yes, but so can many other ways of thinking and doing things. So it's important to note that the Declaration, the UN Declaration, does not provide any universal prescriptive solutions for what self-determination should mean. In fact, it views universal prescriptive solutions as colonial, and it's therefore the antithesis of a universal prescriptive solution. The idea, the intention, is that it provides space for thinking and negotiation of a multitude of political arrangements, with stated options ranging from full autonomy to self-government to, in some cases, participation within state political structures. Although we have to presume many other options could come into the global imaginary as we think about shared sovereignty or plural sovereignty. So the wider implication of all of this is that self-determination from this moment forward in global politics can and will and should mean something other than the independent territorial sovereign state that we've all known for centuries. It means that self-determination and decolonization are continuing to evolve in terms of understandings, and Indigenous rights have an important and pivotal role to play in this conversation. And I think, in fact, in many ways, Indigenous rights are leading this global conversation. So this is a graphic taken right out of the book, in which I try to show Indigenous rights as global change, but also want to show where the largest challenges are. So prior to the passage of the UN Declaration in 2007, international human rights law discourse, again, excluded a couple of elements that were critical to Indigenous peoples. Again, they did not include collective rights, by and large, to maintain things such as culture, language, religion, identity, or one's own educational system or one's own language. And these are the rights that I call soft rights, and they're in the soft cornered box up on my left, your right. And then second, of course, Indigenous people's self-determination and their collective right to maintain lands and political structures were also excluded. So these are the hard rights that we see down on the bottom with the explosion graphic. And the reason I use the explosion is because these are the ones that are most controversial, most contested, and usually spark some sort of conflict when these are on the table. So in the decolonization era, of course, self-determination was, again, presumed to mean statehood, and the Indigenous rights movement is now aiming to reframe and readjust what all of these things can and should mean. So I delineate these rights into hard and soft categories in order to draw out, again, not only what they mean in the global transformation, but also state responses to them. So hard rights strike at some of the fundamentals of the existing international system of states: land, territory, sovereignty, self-determination. And because indigenous groups were presenting and pushing for re-articulations of these concepts, I term them hard rights because they're both difficult to negotiate and they also expose the perceived threat to the hard core of the international system. So soft rights, such as language, culture, education, religion, and so on, are collective rights extensions of existing human rights in the previous order. So while recognition and protection of soft rights involves some amount of change to thinking about inclusion of collective rights, and we have to think about the complementarity of collective rights to individual rights, the changes required to do these things by states and even the international system is not as large, not as big, not as earth-shifting as the changes brought forward by the hard rights. And by and large, the majority of states have accepted them and adapted to them much more readily. But the quest for indigenous rights in the hard rights category, which largely ignited the 30-year battle with states and negotiations with states, was over land and self-determination. Okay, the more difficult pieces. The potential for global change lies in implementation. So implementation, again, requires change on the domestic level, on the international level, and on a state-by-state basis. And restructurings and reorderings of this kind, expecting states to enact and implement legal, constitutional, legislative, and policy changes that will respect such things as indigenous land rights, free prior to informed consent, redress, and all these variety of possible sovereignties, autonomy, self-government, plural sovereignty. These are substantial projects. So while the UN Declaration could potentially, again underscored potentially, represent a very early, a nascent articulation of some new international order and a new way of living and being in the world, at the moment we have hierarchical orders remaining. Hierarchical orders that include domination, extraction, exploitation, colonial control. And indigenous rights, for the most part, though not exclusively as articulated by indigenous political actors, could be on the cutting edge of something radically new that's based instead on indigenous principles, indigenous viewpoints, ontologies that are consistent with indigenous peoples, principles like mutual respect, sustainability, reciprocity, and ongoing negotiation of political questions. So of course, in international relations, and especially in human rights, we study norms, international norms. And we study not only what norms exist, and how they came to exist, but we also examine how they emerge and diffuse and become socialized. This is my Catherine Sickick intervention, and how various political actors react to them. So when I look at indigenous rights through a norms lens, and this is another graphic taken from the book, the norms literature has not yet considered the possibility of fundamental transformation in norms, away from state-centric norm space, what I call the current international order, into an entirely new norm space. This would essentially be the post-colonial completion project. This would be the undermining and the rewriting of all of the remnant colonial structures and all of the practices of the current international system that enabled and continue to maintain colonial domination structures. So I argue that global indigenous politics as a project is dual. So on the one hand, it's operating to seek equality for indigenous people within the existing order, but that's the easier project. The harder project is that it's serving as this transformational norm vector, trying to move, rather unintentionally, the world into a new global norm space. And it's the second category, of course, where we have difficulties and problems. But the new ways of doing global politics in the second norm space together represent changes to the international order that are so fundamental that it actually does break through the constraints of norm space A into B. So while I talk about potential transformation a lot, we can't get too celebratory because we have to recognize the real world and that states, especially wealthy and powerful states like the one we live in, are obviously very heavily invested in the current order. And so while we had almost global consensus in either votes for or later endorsements for the UN Declaration, at least rhetorically, states in reality can be expected in their behavior to be highly recalcitrant in their acceptance of the full body of Indigenous rights. Is that putting it mildly? Recalcitrant. Because we're talking about altering their old ways of doing things. So as several of my book chapters walk through, there are some what I call strange and unexpected patterns of state behavior vis-a-vis Indigenous rights, particularly among the English-speaking settler states. And when I say strange and unexpected, that's speaking in terms of international relations, human rights, and compliance literatures, not so strange and expected from an Indigenous perspective. But I'll highlight a couple of examples from the book. Oh, I need to go back. No, I don't. Sorry. So the first is an observed pattern that I called selective endorsement. So after originally all voting against the UN Declaration in 2007, the four countries of what I call the Anglosphere, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, each later under substantial global political pressure, shifted their official positions to either support or endorse during 2009 and 2010. But it's important to note each of these four countries included important qualifiers, exclusions, and footnotes on how the declaration is to be interpreted in domestic law. So far from what we would call a full endorsement of Indigenous rights at the time, these four countries actually engaged in quite a nuanced behavior. So I argue by selectively endorsing Indigenous rights, these four countries attempted, on the one hand, to express rhetorical support for Indigenous rights, while at the same time, simultaneously, strategically, collectively, and most problematically, unilaterally, writing down the global consensus on Indigenous rights and constraining it so that, by magic wand, their current laws, policies, and practices automatically align with their support and their interpretation of Indigenous rights and its expectations. A second, but very related concept is one I call overcompliance, and that's always in quotes. I had to fight with my editor to keep it always in quotes because they don't like to do that. But I wanted to emphasize that it does not mean overcomplying in terms of exceeding expectations. There's a bit of a play here. So while state compliance with international law in the academy and even in practice is usually only considered as either a binary of compliant and non-compliant, my analysis breaks that open and shows 5 possible outcomes when we look at Indigenous rights compliance by states. A state can be compliant, it can be non-compliant, it can be under-compliant, it can be partially compliant, and it can be overly compliant. So in order, and you'll note, when I say over-compliance, I mean conduct exceeds commitment. Conduct and commitment are the key variables that I'm looking at. So in order to get at this, I had to, because there was not much data on this beginning in 2007, 2008, I had to create my own database. So I constructed the data set of 58 countries with what we call significant indigenous populations, meaning various things in various places. So it could be as low as 0.1% in certain African and Asian countries, up to 15% or so in New Zealand, and substantial proportions in Bolivia. But I use significant following the IWGIA's calculations of what they consider significant. And then I compared such variables as percentage of indigenous population, region, political system, whether it was parliamentary, presidential, semi-presidential, or one party. I looked at legal system, whether it was common law, civil law, common law Islamic, or civil law Islamic. And then I looked at political structure, whether it was federal or unitary in terms of the state. And then I examined each country's position on major human rights treaties, and then also its position on indigenous rights instruments. So I looked at the ILO conventions and then the UN Declaration. And then I noted any changes from 2007 forward. And then I score each of these countries on their indigenous rights commitment, what they say they're going to do, as well as their constitutional, legal, and policy behavior, what they actually do, in order to devise a compliance score. So the table up above shows how I got indigenous rights commitment as either high or low, and then behavior as either strong, moderate, or weak to get the 5 different possibilities. The end results show 17% non-compliant, so these are countries that make no commitment and change no behavior. I've got 52 under-compliant and 21 partially compliant, so these are very closely related and have to do with implementation gaps. So strong promises or medium-sized promises versus implementation capability issues. A couple of them that at the time of writing I deemed compliant because their commitment and their behavior more or less matched up. And then 7% or 4 countries that were over-compliant. And can we guess what the 4 are? US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. So here's just a country list. And I challenge anyone to find any sort of pattern. It's very difficult. The only patterns that really make sense with a common theme are the over-compliant ones. Mm-hmm. So the over-compliant state, it takes certain constitutional, legal, and policy actions that recognize certain categories of rights or certain rights. The key here is that those behaviors exceed the level of commitment. It's counterintuitive, and it's something that I think international politics should pay attention to. So again, it doesn't indicate or imply that these states are completely compliant with, or heaven forbid, exceeding international standards. They most certainly are not. But they are performing above the level based on their very low commitments to indigenous rights. So it's a nuanced behavior. You keep the promises low.
Underperform, over-deliver?
And then you over-deliver.
Under-promise.
Under-promise, over-deliver. So it's a nuanced behavior. So like selective endorsement, it keeps expectations low enough so that the state can then interpret its status quo as being in line with its commitments. So the bottom line, let me see something here. Okay. The bottom line is that states fear indigenous rights. And states, but particularly settler states, feel that they have to contain, control, and limit indigenous peoples, or else some sort of chaos is going to erupt. And states like to act as though indigenous people and indigenous rights are some sort of direct threat to their existence, and so they need to oppose them. My argument in the book is it doesn't need to be this way. It's the old colonial doctrines and colonial practices and discourses and ways of doing business that are expected to be redesigned. So the challenge before all of us is how do we imagine and create and rethink all of these things? And there are a couple different paths that I suggest in my conclusion, which work in tandem in terms of indigenous activism and legal process and political process. On this side, we see the legal remedies, the legal paths. So here we can talk about court systems court structures and so on. The problem is, all of these remain constrained by the current order. And so then the political path comes into play, which I call active deployment. So that's moving the politics, which hopefully then can move the law with some time and effort. So I want to take just a few more minutes to look a little bit deeper at one of the most controversial and highly contested elements of Indigenous rights implementation in Canada, and that's Indigenous self-determination. So just a quick review, again, to Article 3 says that Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination equal to all other peoples. And as we should know, as good political scientists, this right of self-determination has been fundamental since the World War II human rights regime came forward. And it is the centerpiece of all documents coming from the UN, like the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all of the major covenants. Yet again, Indigenous peoples have always been excluded from these in terms of the right to self-determination. So I want to highlight what we would call some challenges of implementation. And the four are interrelated and interconnected. And most of these challenges are not unique to Canada. They're common to all other national, especially colonial, settler colonial contexts. So one of the challenges that we face is that self-determination is normally equated with Westphalian sovereignty, again. The right of self-determination was the rationale for the UN's late 20th century decolonization project, which broke up all of the empires, the European empires around the world. But over that process, states equated self-determination with Westphalian sovereignty. And when self-determination is expressed, it's intended and presumed to be a concrete, discrete moment of articulation or expression of self-determination, meaning either independence as a state, maybe joining with another state, but it's presumed to be a moment of democratic, discrete decision. And so most states, including Canada, generally resist Indigenous claims for self-determination, viewing them as a veiled attempt at secession or independence, and therefore an existential threat. And in fact, a number of Indigenous scholars and activists have criticized the final text of the Declaration as inherently flawed because of the insertion of Article 46, because 46, they say, undermines the intent and outcomes of the Declaration and provides a diminished right of self-determination for Indigenous peoples and therefore renders it virtually meaningless. I argue that both the mainstream view of self-determination as a state and also the critical Indigenous scholars' view are both misdirected. Because I think understandings of decolonization and self-determination have fundamentally shifted with the passage of the Declaration and pointing us to some new future construction. And so again, it's these old colonial doctrines that have been delegitimized, if not in some cases technically overturned in law, where the Declaration has been enshrined in national law, and so on. So the meanings and terms of what we mean by decolonization are just not so clear anymore, and not so simple anymore, not so easily box-checked anymore. We need something different to talk about it. So the new challenge ahead of us is to imagine and create. What does Indigenous self-determination mean as something that doesn't revolve around or necessarily even rely on the construction of a state? So that means that we are all now charged with decoupling sovereignty from self-determination conceptually and trying to figure out what that means. So that's not going to impact only Indigenous peoples, that's going to impact all peoples of the world eventually. The soft rights versus hard rights question. And if we return to the chart briefly, again, the collective experience of Indigenous dispossession and assimilation operated on all of these levels. And so while our Western states are quite accepting to various degrees, some countries more than others, anti-discrimination and soft rights provisions, we all remain challenged on how to deal with land rights and self-determination within our liberal democracies. And again, selective endorsement. So Canada, along with its Anglo cousins, engages, and when I say Anglo, I don't mean necessarily just English speaking, but coming from Britain, of course. They engage in this practice of selective endorsement. So again, this is a strategic logic where the state engages in maintaining its position in the global community with rhetorical support, but actual behavior does not follow. And then both a challenge and an opportunity, I think, are present in global and regional political climates. Again, the global indigenous rights and global indigenous political movements are bringing cutting-edge questions to the surface, and they are helping to reshape, I think, the future structure and practice of global politics in incredibly important ways. By pushing all of these meanings of self-determination, decolonization, beyond purely statist constructions, indigenous rights are presenting fundamental challenges. So how do the rights associated with indigenous nationhood become implemented? Land, resources, self-determination. And how do we, as societies, peacefully accommodate indigenous nationhood, with or without state structures, on a trajectory that leads to these more pluralistic conceptions of sovereignty and territoriality? So one of the biggest challenges, both domestically and globally, is to push for these advances in an atmosphere where settler states continue to both covertly and overtly engage in active resistance to indigenous rights, occasionally with force, but I think more importantly is the cunningly, what I call cunningly manipulative ways. And so these are creating particular sets of challenges. Opportunities. I think there is opportunity space in this country. I think that while these challenges are clearly significant and transformational, I think alongside these challenges there are some opportunities to take a look at. And I don't need to go through the whole list, I'm sure. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, liberal government, placing adoption and implementation of the Declaration into the mandate letters, support at the UN Permanent Forum in May 2016, saying that they would fully support without qualification, which was the important corrective, the UN Declaration. But then quickly followed by a speech at the Assembly First Nations saying that the UN Declaration was unworkable in Canada, so a pause. But then the creation of the Ministers' Working Group with 10 principles, a curious split into 2 ministries. We don't exactly know where that's taking us. But Jody Wilson-Raybould's intention to rewrite the Indian Act, and then just most recently, 2 weeks ago, expressions of support for Bill C-262, which would be the legislative framework of enabling the Declaration. There's some enactments here of selective endorsement, over-compliance. All of these are still very much present, and I think it's very important to continue to watch for the footnotes, the caveats, the exclusions, because they tell us a lot about where the intentions are actually going. But I try to remain optimistic, I really try, that perhaps these rhetorical actions could at least open up some space, but time will tell. And I just want to briefly mention some opportunities on the ground that are happening. And this is actually going to be my next 5-year SSHRC-funded project, which is looking at indigenous-led practices of self-determination. So far apart from state structures, how are indigenous peoples actually doing self-determination on the ground? And curiously, how are they doing it in ways that have not previously been done or that have been done exclusively by states? So how are indigenous peoples enacting external sovereignty in the sense that, again, IR is not necessarily seen, and I want to change that. So how is the change happening? Just a couple quick examples from this research direction. And the project is called Complex Sovereignties, and there's a website under development. And it's going to it'll be 5 to 6 years, SSHRC funded, so we'll be looking at these things. Just a couple of quick examples. Indigenous passports. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, since Diskahe first went to the League of Nations back in the 1920s, has issued and routinely traveled on their own passports and travel documents. Other indigenous groups around the world have been joining the practice. We've spotted cases in Australia, Hawaii, and the Quechua Confederacy of Ecuador. So it's a small but growing practice that is surprising for IR, not when it doesn't work, but actually that it usually does. And so I'm going to be doing some further work on that. Another one that's curious is indigenous peoples, both in Canada and New Zealand, the Maori people of New Zealand and the Yijindi Nation of Australia, have put together and conducted independent trade or diplomatic missions, completely outside the purview of the settler states that they are living in. And so I want to take a closer look at this. What does this mean? And how is this being enacted? And part of what we'll be discussing tomorrow, indigenous peoples' involvement in elements of state external sovereignty. So both in New Zealand and Canada, indigenous peoples are beginning to play a stronger role in consultations over immigration, defense policy, foreign policy, and trade policy. And in the New Zealand case, the Maori have demanded this consultation. With the new government in Canada, since 2015, there's been consultation invited. So there's been important shifts in conversation on these elements. And this one, treaty relations, I find really fascinating because indigenous peoples are increasingly, again, entering into treaty relationships or partnerships with one another, completely outside of state purview. So we have a substantial number of indigenous nations along the Canada-US border that have signed a Buffalo Treaty. And then 85 plus indigenous nations have signed a treaty across that border to fight pipelines from tar sands oil. And then again, the International Indian Treaty Council has been operating in terms of indigenous treaties and partnership models outside of the state since 1974. So it has a long history in this resurgence. So I'm going to be taking a closer, in-depth look at that and what the implications are for global politics. And then what we see as well in many places around the world is an increased enactment of indigenous people's self-determination as guardianship over territory, even absent technical sovereignty or jurisdiction. So instructive cases here include pipeline resistance, most recently at Standing Rock, where the actual point of resistance was not within the technical territory of the tribe, but around it and certainly within what they thought of as their guardianship area. And so a different conception taking place of what we mean by territory and jurisdiction. So as these series of examples show us, implementation of indigenous self-determination, indigenous rights can take a multitude of forms. But whatever form it takes, it necessarily in practice leads to a reinterpretation of what we understand to be self-determination, and it's shifting us away from purely state-centric constructions. So now, again, all of us are charged with imagination, creativity, innovation, and most importantly, negotiation. How do we recognize plural sovereignty? How do we do power sharing? What are its possibilities? And how do we protect the land, self-determination, and collective rights of indigenous peoples while not disrupting territorial integrity of states? That's a huge problem. And that is, I would say, the most important challenge facing all of us in the coming age. So, thank you.
Thanks very much.